Good morning and happy fifth year anniversary of the 9:30 call week to all those who celebrate. It's great to see folks. Doug Howgate, that's quite a setup you have going there.
Yeah, it's just their conference room, but yeah.
I mean, we'll give folks a minute to join. My computer is very slow. Uh, as folks are joining, it's great to see everybody on this rainy Monday morning. Happy St. Patrick Day also for those who celebrate. Which apparently this weekend in South Boston was a lot of people. Um, as folks are joining, also just want to remind folks that we're doing the live broadcast on Thursday at the Worcester Public Library. We'd love to have you join us in person there and on Zoom on our regular link. Senator Robin Kennedy will be joining us in Worcester. Um, and we have lots of folks who are contributing quotes and videos. So we'll put that link in chat too. The preschool teacher me is also doesn't want to tell you this yet, but we launched our new website this morning. So but I want you to pay attention to Doug. So don't look at the website yet. Pay attention to Doug and but we're really, really excited. We'll have more time to talk about kind of all the improvements that we've made, including advocacy headquarters. But today, Doug Howgate, you are helping us kick off this special week here on the 9:30 call. So we're so glad to be with you, and I'll turn things right over to you. You should be able to share your screen. I know Victoria's here too, so I'll leave it up to you two.
Hey,
Great.
thanks everybody. Just wanted to pop on and introduce Doug. Doug is our president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, our fearless leader, and we've been working recently on some federal funding data points. So I thought that would be helpful for everybody to see today, and hopefully we'll also be publishing something on that soon as well.
Great. Yeah, no, so very happy for us to be presenting here this morning. And let me do it this way. So some of you folks may have seen a presentation we did for our group that the United Way has been convening a couple weeks ago now on how to think about potential federal impacts. And so this is a slightly adjusted version of that. I want to be clear, while I've got a slide or two in here specific to the Child Care Development Block Grant, it's really more about kind of how to think about federal funding and its impact on Massachusetts more broadly. Happy to take questions, but I think the reason why you're not going to see a lot more childcare information in here, well, there's a couple of reasons, but one of them kind of speaks to a larger theme, which is a lot of this remains us waiting for things to happen as opposed to reacting to things that have already happened. And there was a story in the Herald last week that they reached out to us on, and I would just say by way of introduction, obviously there's a great deal going on at the federal level that's going to have profound impacts on Massachusetts and already has had profound impacts on Massachusetts. As you think about how it affects the state budget, state spending decisions, things like that, a lot of that stuff is still in the speculative realm. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be very, very mindful of it or kind of honest about the chance for downside risk. At the same time, I would also caution folks, and happy to talk about this, we don't want to panic in advance of things happening. And you don't want to jump to conclusions or do things now that can't be undone. The reality is that there's still so much we don't know. And so it's really trying to walk folks through that. So with that in mind, let me take some time to go through the slides, but as always, happy to take questions. So kind of generally speaking, as we think
And
about.
Doug, I'm so sorry. Can you do a little bit about you? Because you've had many different roles before you joined Mass Taxpayers. Just do a quick tour of
Sure.
Doug Howgate's best.
Sure. So Doug, I'm the president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. I've worked here a few different times in various roles. I've also worked on the State House a few different times. I was budget director of the Ways and Means Committee for 5 years, and I was a policy advisor to Senate President Spilka for her first term. I worked at Mass Budget Policy Center back in the day, so have been in and around kind of public policy in Massachusetts for a while. And this is one of the one of the things that MTF is trying to do, hopefully, I know Victoria demonstrates this every time she talks to you folks, is our goal is to be a resource, broadly speaking, for folks who care about kind of the intersection of public policy and the long-term future of the Commonwealth. And I am not personally monitoring the chat, and so if there are specific questions
Yeah,
in the
I
chat,
can do that, Doug. And I know
yeah,
Victoria will. Lots of appreciation.
this guy,
Yep.
yeah, fair enough. All right, so let me get started. So as you think about this broad construct that we don't know what's going to happen with the feds, but we should be prepared for some negative impacts, there's really three broad reasons why that is. One is ideological, right? And I say this, by the way, without I'm not going to give you my subjective opinion on, well, I may creep in a couple points in time, but irrespective of where you stand on issues, the reality is that a number of the things that the Trump administration is prioritizing has tensions with things that Massachusetts does, right? When you think about whether it's gender affirming care, when you think about approach to immigration, when you think about any number of things, think about some of the more ideological decisions we've seen for National Institutes of Health funding. There are things that have happened and will likely happen that at a fundamental level have tensions with the way Massachusetts does stuff, and that's going to create challenges, right? So that's kind of the most broad overarching one. But there's two other reasons why I think we're tracking potential challenges, one of which is practical, right? And who knows where this lands? And I think this is one where sometimes the panic can get out front of the reality. But the fact of the matter is, what do we know is the biggest kind of public policy goal for the new Congress and the Trump administration? It's to extend and potentially expand the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so a major tax bill that was passed in 2017. That's really expensive. And so, irrespective of ideological differences, in order to pay for that, the Congress is going to have to demonstrate that they have paid for it. One way that they can do that, and the kind of most valid way, honestly, is to make cuts to other spending areas. Now, I think what we may see in the weeks and months ahead is more and more of a push for, say, creative accounting to pay for it, which in the big picture probably is good for the national deficit of the United States, but probably is directionally a little more positive for, say, Medicaid spending in the next couple of years. So, but there's a practical impact there. And then the other one is really what we've seen most to date, which was what I would call process impacts, which are, everyone might recall at the end of January when there was this idea of pausing federal funds. That created a lot of kind of process fallout, right? People didn't know what that meant, what they needed to do. People paused action. They delayed hiring. They kind of a lot of things that are going to have real-time consequences in terms of actions because there's a lot of uncertainty and you don't know what is coming down the pike. And there's some directive that comes out that seems to tell you should be doing something. And so you don't have clear information, but you may be a little more conservative in your action because of that. I think that's really what we've seen almost the most of thus far, though we've seen other impacts as well. So those are the three ways we're thinking about it. And then in terms of like the matrix of how impacts affect Massachusetts, there's more than four, but there's basically four, right? There's direct impacts from the Trump administration and from Congress. So those would be like the Trump administration reducing indirect spending on National Institutes of Health grant spending, right? That has when and if that goes forward, that will have a direct impact on resources into the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Another example would be if Congress, in their final budget, if they're able to move forward with budget reconciliation, if they made Medicaid cuts, that would have a direct impact on Massachusetts. But there's also a lot of indirect impacts, both at the executive branch and at the legislative level. So tariffs, right? The Trump administration pursuing tariffs and kind of the uncertainty that goes along with that, that has a major economic impact that affects Massachusetts. Another example would be whenever Congress does move forward with a tax bill, what we saw actually the last time it happened in the near term was a real increase in state tax collection because of a few different ways that our tax code piggybacks to the federal tax code. But irrespective, you would see impacts on state tax collections based on this broader bill that Congress passed. So those are kind of some of the ways we're thinking about direct and indirect impacts. And then where are we going to see impacts? And again, you could see them everywhere, but in our mind, there's kind of four, right? There's a broader economic impact, right? The Massachusetts economy is a captive of the global economy and certainly the U.S. economy. So it's the state economy, the U.S. economy goes in one direction, it's going to take Massachusetts along with it. There's public sector impacts, right? If there were to be a change, for example, on block grant funding or things like that, that is a public sector impact on Massachusetts. Private sector impact, you certainly are seeing that already in terms of whether it's decisions related to workforce or DEI or potential tax implications of policies moving forward. And then the nonprofit sector, and obviously this ranges from Harvard to very small nonprofits in places like the childcare sector. You see a variety of impacts as well that really can run the gamut. So those are kind of four of the things we're thinking about. All right. So let's just do some context setting, and I want to be mindful of time as well. So of the federal budget, and the most recent data we had on this, we'll update this soon, but it's for federal fiscal year 2023. The most of the federal budget is defined as mandatory spending, a smaller share as discretionary spending. Okay, so mandatory spending, you can still make changes to mandatory spending, but you have less flexibility. When we think of mandatory spending, 3/4 of that is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And so again, especially as we've seen proclamations that Medicare and Social Security spending is not going to be touched, that is why you've seen so much attention on potential Medicaid cuts. Because if you need to make up the difference in whatever you are going to spend on tax cuts, and you need to demonstrate zero cost impact over 10 years, if you're taking off the two biggest spending programs, if you're taking those off the table, by implication, the third biggest, Medicaid, is very much on the table. So that's why you're seeing a lot of attention on this. And what I would say too is, this doesn't mean there won't be reductions in other programs as well. We've already seen proposals on something like SNAP or food stamps. But food stamps, just to put this in perspective, which provides benefits to about 1 million Massachusetts residents, is just 3.5% of mandatory spending, right? So it pales in comparison to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. And on the other end of the ledger, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the Child Care Development Block Grant. The Child Care Development Block Grant is like $8 billion a year, right? So it's just it's a little less than 1% of Medicare spending, right? So that doesn't mean they're not going to make changes and things, but as you think about the kind of adage of going where the money is, the good thing about some of those block grants is there's not a whole lot of money in there if you're looking to balance the federal budget. All right, so let's now talk about what the feds are doing in state operations. So there's kind of two ways to think about what the feds do in state operations. There's direct contributions from the federal government in our state budget, which we'll talk about in a second. And then there's a lot of things that the state and local government does that receives federal grants that moves outside of the state budget. An example of that would be much of the federal support for Head Start, for example, does not flow through the state budget, right? There's a small state subsidy in the state budget, but the vast majority of Head Start funding goes direct from the feds to folks who implement it, right? So that's a real impact, but it's not a real impact you would see just looking at the state budget. In terms of the state budget, 25% of every dollar we spend in the $60 billion budget approximately comes from the feds. The vast majority of that is through Medicaid reimbursements, but Child Care Development Block Grant and a block grant related to cash assistance for low-income families, the TANF block grant, those also flow through the state budget, okay? Outside of the state budget, there's another $4 to $5 billion in federal grants that the state administers. These include things like low-income heating and energy assistance, or Title I grants for public schools, special education funding, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff in there as well. And then outside of that are things like SNAP, right? Head Start doesn't get included in many of those things. So there's other stuff that's not even included in here, but basically there's these two ways to think about the financing. There's what's in the state budget, and there's federal grants outside of the state budget administered by the state. So this is federal dollars in the state budget looking back 10 years or so. And what you see here is and if we did FY 2025, it would be about $15 billion. It is down slightly from where it was during the pandemic. That's not because of American Rescue Plan spending. That was set aside from the budget. That's really a function of the fact that, one, we got more federal emergency management funding, which does flow through the budget often, and we got enhanced Medicaid reimbursements. We also got a little bit more in things like Child Care Development Block Grants, right? There were other things in there as well, but by and large, it's really enhanced Medicaid reimbursements. And just to put Medicaid reimbursements in context, For every dollar we receive as a state from the sales tax, we get $1.50 in Medicaid reimbursement. So it's second only to the state's income tax in terms of its size in the state budget. And I'm going to come back to what that means in terms of where we spend money in a second, because that has implications in childcare as well. But I'll come back to that in a second. And then when you also just think in terms of why, and I'm sorry for all the Mass Health focus, but this is something we've looked at most primarily recently. Mass Health also provides some form of insurance to 2 million state residents, right? So to put that in perspective, right, we subsidize childcare for what, 50,000 families or thereabouts. We provide K-12 education to 900,000 kids. So Mass Health is just orders of magnitude larger than any other program the state operates, which just demonstrates how close that connection between state and federal financing works. You know what? I'm not going to talk about this. This is about off-budget healthcare spending. I don't think that's really germane for this audience. So let me talk instead about block grants. So two major block grants flow through the state budget. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Block Grant, or the TANF Block Grant, which supports primarily cash assistance for low-income families, and the Child Care Development Block Grant. Now, total, we get like 550. Now it's probably closer to $600 million from those two grants. So again, on the scale of the entire budget, that's just about 1%. It's not particularly big, but obviously it is a notable source of resources that relates to childcare. This shows you the Child Care Development Block Grant general authorization. This does not include our pandemic subsidies. This is just the basic block grant that we get, and we see it's grown pretty significantly over the last decade, though it hasn't grown as fast as total childcare spending in the budget, I will say. And so just a couple of things on this before I get to other stuff, because I can imagine this coming up. So we get like $200 million a year from the Child Care Development Block Grant or thereabouts. I am not aware of any specific proposals to cut, certainly eliminate that block grant. So one, let me say that. But let's say for a second that we saw a federal bill move forward that reduced spending for the Child Care Development Block Grant by $50 million for Massachusetts. Let's just say that for example. If that were to happen, it would reduce revenue the state receives by $50 million. That is absolutely true. And so the state would need to figure out how to cover that $50 million. It would not reduce childcare spending by $50 million. Why is that? Well, that's because we receive it as a block grant, that it also comes with it requirements for what the state needs to spend. Massachusetts spends far in excess of what the federal government requires Massachusetts to spend on childcare development. And so in any real sense, the block grant we receive is simply money to the general fund. It is simply resources we get from the feds that is related to the Child Care Development Block Grant. But there is nothing mechanical that says if we lose $1 of Child Care Development Block Grant money, we need to reduce childcare spending by $1. There is nothing that would require that. Now, we would need to reduce spending somewhere by $1, right? That's not to say there's not an impact, but it is not localized to the area in which the block grant is received. Now, for some folks may remember in better times, this cuts the other way too. If we get more money from the Child Care Development Block Grant next year, for reasons that no one is anticipating, it doesn't mean we need to spend any more money on child care either, because we are so far in excess of what the feds say we need to spend. So it is true that one of the major sources of federal funding in the state budget is related to childcare in the Child Care Development Block Grant. And those are real resources that the state uses every year. And so any change in those resources changes the level of resources the state has. That is all true. However, for any of these things, there is no mechanical connection between what we receive from that block grant and what we spend in the program area the block grant is associated with. So I'm happy to take questions. Let me move through some other stuff, Amy, and then because I know that can be confusing for folks, but I wanted to kind of talk through that for a second. In terms of other federal grants, so as I mentioned before, there's about $5 billion in other federal grants assumed in the state budget. There's about 500 of them.
Wow.
They are, by and large, 60% of them or so are in a few areas. So K-12 is a huge area for federal grants. Housing, so like Section 8 vouchers is a huge area. Women in, the WIC food security program is a big one. Low-income fuel assistance is a big one, and disaster assistance is a big one. So that's really where you see the big dollar figures associated with federal grants. Now, again, this doesn't include like SNAP. SNAP would be separate from this. SNAP is obviously hundreds of millions of dollars to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts every year, actually billions of dollars. That is separate and distinct from this. But this is where you see those federal grants in the state budget as well. And then we also, a lot of folks in the state's workforce are supported by federal grants. The federal number is probably in the 2,000 to 4,000 range. But all that's to say is if we were to see a major change in federal grant support for the state, it could have a major impact on people who work for the state, right? Is that the last slide? I guess that was the last slide. So let me stop here and take questions. And sorry, I kept this kind of short. I know I speak very quickly, but I figured there might be.
Thank you, Doug. We appreciate it. So there is one comment. Yes, this is so comprehensive. And if nothing else, it puts you at ease that there are great people looking out for residents and the things that matter to them. Thank you. And lots of appreciation with that. Doug, and Victoria, I'm sure you're, hello. Good morning, Ashley White. Tom Weber says, Doug and Victoria, thank you. Do you anticipate if so, and when the Healy administration legislature will provide an update on the downstream effects, example, current FY25 and 26 planning for the federal actions? I'm going to get all the questions out there, Doug. Could we imagine a significant language change to the CCDBG budget language or regulations that could impact how this money and matching funds need to be spent? Like something punitive about which populations cannot be served, or language saying more of these funds need to go on paid parental leave. My board wants to know how C3 grants are connected to the federal monies.
Yep.
And also just Danielle Ewan will be with us tomorrow on the 9:30 call to give us a federal update. So this is kind of good timing. And then Ashley, I'll go to you. So Doug, those two questions, then we'll go to Ashley.
Okay. So for Tom's question, I wouldn't anticipate any adjustments to the FY26 budget at this stage of the game until we know more, right? So I think and by the way, I think that's the smart way to go. If the House or the Senate were to make major changes based on presumed spending cuts or revenue changes, like they would just be guessing. And so I don't think you're going to see that. And I think the more and more we've heard from DC, the more you see them focus on, again, kind of creative accounting to pay for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension as opposed to major cuts, because cuts are tough, right? They're tough to get through Congress. So I don't anticipate anything in the next 2 months for FY26. In terms of FY25, that stuff you would see from the Healy administration, obviously. They're tracking all of it. I don't think they have any news right now, right? So I think that you're going to see a supplemental budget from the Healy administration at some point in the next week or two. I wouldn't anticipate anything. You could anticipate some stuff on the margins around federal action, maybe giving them more flexibility on closing the books and stuff like that. But I don't anticipate any like major spending revenue decisions. I think the next time you're likely to see something would be in a closeout supplemental budget if we know more. So that's the answer to that one. CCDBG language changes. Who knows? Well, many people might know. I don't know. I would say philosophically, I would be concerned about that, but I have no specific information or intelligence on that. I would say, Mark Riley, EOE is probably a good person to talk to on that. He's got a lot of good connections. Certainly, we'll stay on top of that stuff, but I'm not aware of anything, but I can't tell you not to be concerned. And then in terms of C3, C3 is fully paid for with state dollars right now, right? So there's two ways to think about this, and you can't remember one and forget the other. One, the good news is, again, there is nothing mechanical that says the feds are going to do this, so we have to cut C3, right? It is a state program. It is not piggybacking on a federal program anymore. That said, if the state loses significant resources from the feds, they will make resource reductions to account for that, and that could absolutely affect programs. And just if you think about how to triage where program spending reductions are going to occur, they're going to occur where money is, and oftentimes they're going to occur where people think there's going to be the least impact, and oftentimes least impact is correlated with newest programs. I am not saying that means there's going to be cuts to C3 by any means, just know when people look to balance the books when they have to, they're going to go where the money is, and they're going to go where they think that there's the least reasonable assumption that those programs have an impact and will continue if history is any guide. And so, can I tell you that C3 would be off the table? No. At the same time, don't panic right now. C3 is fully funded in the FY26 budget proposal today. Nothing's changed in that regard, but we'll be back in touch as we learn more. And I know Ashley had a
We'll
question.
go to Ashley, and then I know Kate Warren Barnes has a question.
Thanks. Great presentation, Doug. And I have two questions, but maybe I'll order them accordingly since we only have a couple minutes left. Just wanted to have you maybe put a finer point on the slide where you were talking about, cuts to CCDF, not necessarily meaning cuts in the state budget for childcare. Certainly agree that don't want to be sort of alarmist here, but is the finer point that we could decide to therefore balance the budget by making cuts to some childcare spending if CCDF has some cuts, but we could also find that money elsewhere in the state budget if we so decided to. So it's not a guarantee, but it is a possibility. Is that a good summation of what you were trying to say?
Yes. So, and maybe an example would be helpful here. So back in 2020 or 2021, there was a supplemental CCDBG payment to states. And at the time, there was a lot of frustration, anger in the childcare sector because we didn't spend it on childcare, right? And the same rationale applies that because of where the state spend is on these things, honestly, the annual state appropriation decisions on childcare are removed from what we get for the child care development block grant because they don't have to be connected. And so that's not to say if we were to get a reduction in child care development block grant, the policy decision would not be made to reduce child care spending. That's possible. But the real impact to the state is we're losing resources that have to be absorbed in the budget writ large.
Thanks. Yeah, that's
And I
helpful.
just add to it, again, it's because those monies flow through the general fund and the state budget, as opposed to, as Doug mentioned, federal Head Start flows directly to providers. So
Right.
if that gets cut, that's going to be a cut to providers. So kind of the distinction of when the money flows through the general fund, there's more discretion at the state level of how to balance that.
And
Great
Amy,
point.
I'll hold my last
Okay.
question just to give room for other folks.
Kate.
Hi, yeah, really quickly. Good morning, Doug. Thank you for this. Good to see you. And I really appreciate the framework for assessing impact. That's super helpful. So thank you for that. My question is, as somebody who was in healthcare in a former life, the mass health stuff is the thing that keeps me up at night. But I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about, does our 1115 waiver, which expires in 2027, provide any type of a protective factor for Massachusetts as we kind of face these uncertainties around Medicaid and the revenue that it brings to the state?
Yeah, great question. So the state's Medicaid program offers under several waivers, the biggest one of which was recently negotiated and is in effect until 2027. And I think the challenges in the conversations we've had with Mass Health is like, there's not a lot of historical precedent for people going into the 1115 waiver and revoking it or, pausing it or whatever. But who knows, right? But can you say that? So I think that, like many things, I know this isn't super comforting. I think the action to date, which is the right one, has been to let's continue as if the things we've agreed to in good faith are going to continue to be in effect, and react to and not pretend and not kind of overreact and speak negative actions into existence. At the same time, I think that there's legitimate concern that we could see a change in approach on how existing waivers are kind of upheld. I think that is an ongoing concern. And then I think there's major concerns about when we have to renegotiate this thing, kind of what happens then.
Please join me in the chat by thanking Doug for joining us today.
Thank you,
And
folks.
Reingold, I saw your question. I'm going to send that to Danielle too, who's joining us tomorrow. So Danielle, you will provide kind of what she's in DC, kind of hearing what's happening in DC. But please add your appreciation in chat for Doug. We really appreciate you coming, especially
Thank
on
you.
historic week for the 9:30 call.
Yeah, congrats.
And
Happy
so
anniversary.
we have a new kind of refreshed 9:30 call web landing page, and it's much clearer about where the follow-up materials are. So Doug, if you send me the slides,
Sure.
we'll add the slides to the follow-up folder, and then we'll post the video on YouTube. So
Awesome.
thank you so much. And we will see everyone tomorrow with an update from Danielle Ewing. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, Victoria.